Hello and welcome to the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about why we need to stop strengthening the lower back, the psoas, and what is a more effective way of rehabilitating lower back pain and building low back strength endurance. If you're struggling with lower back pain and you want some help, click the link below and you'll go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain consultation and coaching. This can be done online or face-to-face. Alternatively, if you want to build low back strength endurance, again, the link is below that goes through to my How to Build Low Back Strength Endurance 12-week online program. I'd like to start this section with a quote from, I think it's this book here, called Movement by Gray Cook. It opened my eyes to what I've just described, which is looking at the body with a wider perspective. So not just thinking about muscles when we talk about rehabilitation, but talking about other tissues, but also thinking about muscles and their different roles within the body, and then training the role rather than the muscle, if that makes sense. So it's common to seek stabilization programs that attempt to train stabilizers like prime movers using concentric and eccentric movements. Unfortunately, this assumes that strengthening the stabilizers will cause it to stabilize more effectively. Common strengthening programs are applied to muscles with a stabilization role, which will increase the concentric strength, but have little impact on the timing and recruitment, which are the essence of stabilization. So within that quote, it's basically describing that that muscles have different roles and we need to train those roles. So as I described in the previous section with let's just say the current method about we have a weak lower back, we need to strengthen that lower back. We are essentially saying that the muscles of the spine are prime movers and we need to train them like prime movers, i.e. we need to strengthen them in a concentric or an eccentric movement. Whereas when you dive into anatomy of the spine and the role of the muscles around the spine, you find out that they are more stabilizing exercises. And as is mentioned there, stabilization is about timing and recruitment, not about eccentric and concentric. It's more about isometric, which is a static contraction. Now, that's not to say that they can't go through eccentric and concentric. It's just saying that's not their primary role, because even parts of the bicep have a stabilization to it. So there are nuances and there are different contexts in which we need to treat certain areas of the body. Obviously, we're talking about the spine and the muscles that are around it. So when it comes to strengthening the lower back, we don't really need to do it. What we need to do is we need to train muscle timing and recruitment. So what starts to happen now is we start to look at balance, type and style exercises. Now these can be static and these can be dynamic, but it doesn't mean lots of movement at the spine, because what we want the spine muscles to do, or the muscles of the spine to do, we've got the vertebrae that stack on top of each other. We've got the 5 lumbar vertebrae that don't have any bony structures holding them in place to stabilize them. Obviously, the thoracic spine has the rib cage, and that does a great deal of stabilization. The lumbar spine doesn't have that. So we have to treat the muscles of the lower back, or the lower spine, as more stabilization. So what does this look like? Well, as I mentioned, it looks much more like balance style exercises. So what we need to be doing is we need to train stabilizers with stability. We need to train prime movers with movement, and that's the traditional style of training. So the glutes, the quads, the biceps, the triceps, in some respects the pecs, the lats. They can go through these large ranges of movement using concentric and eccentric loads to strengthen them. Whereas psoas, obviously it does flex the hip, but if you think about strengthening the psoas, it only needs to lift the knee, and it also needs a quickness of movement as well. If we talk about sprinting, it doesn't need to lift huge amounts of load because it's only lifting the leg up. And if we're talking about sporting activities, it needs to move, it needs to lift the knee, and it needs to lift it quickly, which doesn't necessarily come again with high load. It comes with moving quickly. But a part of the psoas being able to do its job is to have a stable spine, because that's where the psoas anchors from. So if you've got an unstable spine, you've got an unstable psoas. So we need to, or we've got an unstable platform for the psoas to work, so it's going to not work as effectively if the spine is unstable. So we need to be able to bring stability to the spine. And what we're going to do in the next section is we're going to talk a little bit more about the anatomy of what's involved in that, and then in the final section we'll be able to talk more about exercises based on what we talked about here and what we've talked about in the next section. So how do we bring stability to the spine, and how do we bring strength to the spine, let's say? Now, we're going to go and talk about a component within our neuromuscular system, and it's called, or they are called, Golgi tendon organs. What they do is they detect force going through a muscle and a tendon. If they detect too much force going through a tendon or a muscle, they will then dampen all that back, because what they are perceiving is too much force. So what they will do is they will shut that down. This is all done on an unconscious basis. So when we are talking about a weak lower back, there is a good chance it is not because the muscle is weak. It is because these Golgi tendon organs are dampening the signals and the force going through the muscle, giving you the manifestation, no, not the manifestation, giving you the perception of weakness. So it seems like the muscle's weak, and then we need to go and strengthen it. But we don't need to strengthen it because it's not weak. Because if we can give the body the perception that there's not too much force going through, it will keep the force going through the muscle, and therefore the muscle will strengthen, and the muscle will have the capacity to deal with that load. So it's the force going through it isn't determined by the muscle. It's determined by these Golgi tendon organs that are perceiving too much load or too little load, if that makes sense. So when it comes to strengthening a lower back, so if we go from the perspective, or if we use the context of lower back pain. So when pain is involved, these Golgi tendon organs will shut muscles down, or it will dampen load. Think of them like a fuse in a fuse box for a house. If too much electricity comes through into the house, it will shut the fuse off. If too much electricity is going into a household appliance, it will shut the appliance down. Because what will happen if too much electricity goes in, it'll overload the system, and the potential for it to catch fire is increased. Not that that's going to happen in the body, but if you overload a muscle and a system like that, it will break, essentially. If you put too much load through a muscle, it will tear, the tendon will rupture, whatever it may be. So the Golgi tendon organs are there as a protective mechanism to dampen how much the muscle's working, which gives you that perception of weakness. So what we need to be able to do is we need to stabilize the lower back. We need to give the Golgi tendon organs the perception of stability. if we can give them that perception of stability, then they don't need to shut down and they don't need to dampen what the muscle's doing. So if we stabilize the spine, strength will come back. So if we test a muscle and it comes out as weak, if we then go about stabilizing the joint around that muscle, we then retest. What should then happen in the test is the muscle comes back as strong, but we haven't done any concentric or eccentric movements that go with that. So what needs to happen is stability. As the quote mentioned, it needs timing and recruitment. If we again talk about the psoas, it needs a stable platform of the 5 lumbar vertebra, because that's where it joins on. So if we can get quadratus lumborum, the abdominal wall, to go a little bit further afield, if we get glute medius, glute minimus, because again, that the pelvis is a part of all of that. So if we can get all that together, what we can then start to do is we can then start to have greater stability of the spine, and then therefore the Golgi tendon organs work, we get the strength of the lower back without doing any strengthening exercises. That's why strengthening exercises in some respects are futile, because they're working against what the body is trying to do. Because when you add load to the lower back and start doing back extensions, there will be some adaptation, but the body is always going to be fighting against that because it perceives instability or a problem in the area. So what we need to be able to do is bring stability to the area, and then therefore the muscle will just respond accordingly and strength will just come back naturally and it will just lift without doing any strengthening exercises in the area. And this is what this is what Gray Cook talks about. This is a lot about what McGill talks about. There is also elements of what Kelly Starrett talks about in the supple leopard. It's about getting the body to work as it was built to work. But if you just look at the muscles, it will tell you one story. Oh, well, a muscle contracts, a muscle lengthens. What we need to do to make it stronger is we need to put load through it, and we need to contract and relax, contract, relax. Whereas when we start looking at the neuromuscular system, it starts to tell us a different story. We can talk about stretching as well. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial, but we can talk about that as well, because there is another mechanism within the neuromuscular system that's influencing that. But for now, we're talking about strengthening. So to sort of finish off this part, when we are strengthening a muscle, we only really need to strengthen them, or we need to strengthen prime movers like a bodybuilder does, but not necessarily stabilizers like a bodybuilder does. Because when we bring stability to stabilizing muscles, their strength just comes back naturally. And they start working together and syncing up and making a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, that is described and I've said many more times. So I could go around in circles and talk about this and repeat myself a lot. But what we'll do in the next part is start talking about what does that look like with regards to exercises that are chosen. Exercises that we can use for rehabilitating a lower back. Now, with regards to the pain of the lower back, this is different. So I'm not going to include pain in this. I'm talking about instability through the spine. So pain isn't necessarily involved within this. Now, when we are talking about stabilization, we are talking about, as I've mentioned, timing and recruitment. Now, this has its sort of foundations in, let's just call it balanced, or partly balanced training. So simple exercises like balancing on one knee. So you've got one knee on the floor, so you're in the half kneeling position, one knee on the floor, 1 foot on the floor. And when there is wobble, that shows the muscles aren't timing and recruiting properly. When you have steady posture, so in a static position, when you have a steady posture, that shows that there is good muscle recruitment and muscle timing. So the muscles on either side of the joint, they communicate with each other. When you wobble, one contracts, one relax, and then it goes the other way, and then it goes the other way. That's wobble. That's what wobble is. When you've got a steady posture, they're just going like that. So they're well synced together, they're communicating well with each other, and they're holding the joint in place. And that will be described as a steady posture in a balanced position, so in that half kneeling position. If we then add movement into it, so you get good balance, you get good control, you get smoothness of movement. That shows good stability. So when we're talking about rehabilitation, those are the things that we need. Now, when we start bringing in other exercises, so we need the ability to brace. So we need things like planks, side planks, bridges, and things like that. So we need to bring that type of stability, because what that does, that allows us to consciously brace. When we're talking about balance exercises, we're talking about very much an unconscious training, if you will, because you can't think, I'm going to train these muscles to turn on and off. When we go into a balance position, all we can focus on is being steady. And then what happens is the muscles respond to that and maintain that steady posture. When we're talking about a conscious control, we're talking about a brace. So this goes down the route of McGill a little bit more. So we would brace the abdominals, and what that does, that essentially locks the spine in place. So like the ropes for a sail, when you tack the sail down, you hold it in place, you pull the ropes taut, and the sail is held in place. Guy ropes on a tent, you pull those tight, the tent stays steady. It's the same with these muscles. They join on to the 5 vertebrae of the lumbar spine, you lock them in position, that holds the 5 lumbar vertebrae in place. One of the other roles of the torso is that sort of change of movement as well. So if we take a plank, we lift an arm up. So we go from 2 arms down, we create more instability, we lift an arm up. Now, as we lift the arm up, if the hips move from side to side, the muscles aren't timing and recruiting properly, and then you get the wobble. So again, we go back to that wobble, and what we need when we lift an arm up is we need steady pelvis. You can say the same for a bridge. When you do a shoulder bridge, shoulders on the floor, hips in the air, feet on the floor. When you lift one foot off the floor, you don't want your hips to drop, you don't want your hips to shift side to side, and you don't want your hips to roll. All of this is in the assessment that I do for people that want to stabilise their lower back. It's a part of the lower back pain consultation and assessment process that I take people through. So what we're trying to do is create that steady posture. What we can then do is then bring that up onto the feet. Once they've got it in a static position, they've built their brain, they've built their neuromuscular system, and they've built their muscular system to be able to do that. Then we can make more movements more complex, and we can bring them up onto their feet and create smoothness of movement, muscular contraction, bracing of the abdominals, things like that. So we're developing it step by step. So when we talk about should you move the spine or should you not move the spine, it depends. It depends where you are in the process. It depends where you're starting from. Are you starting from a painful perspective? Are you just talking from an instability perspective? So we have to take all this into consideration. So if we just go in and just start strengthening the lower back by doing loads of back extensions, or strengthening the psoas by tying a weight to your foot and lifting it up loads of times, that's a pretty remedial understanding of how the body works, because you're just looking at the muscle and you're just looking at strength, when they need much more than that, when there are more components at play, when there is more anatomy that can be affected by that. So we have to upskill and upgrade that level of understanding, because then that filters into the rehabilitation process. Because what we're doing is we're using stabilizers as stabilizers, we're using prime movers as prime movers, and we're training them to be able to work together better. So when we lift the knee with the psoas, we've got a stable spine for the psoas to lock in against. But that comes from having the abdominal wall do its job properly, from the QL doing its job properly, from the longissimus and iliocostalis to do its job properly, which is essentially to hold the spine in place so that the psoas can lift the knee more effectively. Or if we're talking about a deadlift, we need all those muscles to lock the spine in place so you can translate the force that's generated in the glutes and the quads to lift the weight that go through the torso, down the arm and into the bar. So even from a performance perspective, we need the stabilizers to do their job properly, which is to stabilize and hold the joint in place so the muscles can pull against it more effectively. Because if you've got a joint that wobbles, then the prime movers can't put their force through it. So if you want stronger prime movers, stabilize a joint, because the Golgi tendon organs will allow more force to go through them. So not only are the Golgi tendon organs regulating the force of the stabilizers, they're regulating the force of the prime movers. If you've got weakness going through stabilizers, or instability going through stabilizers, I should say, that's going to affect how the prime movers work, because the Golgi tendon organs won't let the force go through the muscle to lift the bar. If the joint is stable, it will allow that to happen. And there are different ways of doing that and different training ways of doing that, depending on what the goal is, depending on what the starting point is, so on and so forth. So again, I could go on. I think it's a good place to end it here. If you have any questions, leave them below. If you've enjoyed the content, hit the like button. If you've learned something new, hit the thanks button. If you again have a comment or a question, leave it below. If you want to watch more tutorials or episodes like this, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. I'll speak to you in the next episode.